Readers, it feels good to be moving into these kinds of text. There is a lot that is engaging and kind of cool about them. You may have noticed that it feels easier to listen to someone teaching you in a podcast or to watch and learn from a movie or an animated graphic than from reading something in print. This week, you're going to continue to study a powerful issue that arose in your reading, but you'll get to do this in these new vibrant formats. This should add to and sometimes change your thinking as you make new connections. Think for a moment about an issue that you'll be studying this week. What do you think you'll gain by reading in these new formats about your issue? Think for a moment. What might listening to a podcast offer if you're studying gender issues, or war, or peace? Think about your issue. What will you hope these texts will offer? You might hear new perspectives told in the first person by people with firsthand experience, or you might get to see or hear settings you might have trouble imagining. There is a lot these technologies can do to enhance our understanding. Yesterday, you noticed that reading digitally can also present challenges. Today, let's think about how some of what you've already been practicing in print text may help you in other formats. You just might have to figure out how to transfer that work to the new genres. Look at the other charts from earlier bends or other charts in your reading notebook. If you didn't find yourself referring to your charts in your reading notebook during yesterday's reading, you might want to try that today. Well, today I want to teach you that learning from digital text, such as podcasts and interactive articles, requires flexibility. Sometimes the strategies you've learned will transfer directly, but at other times you'll need to find a new way to apply a strategy or invent new strategies to tackle the challenges these texts pose. You're going to get to try this a lot this week in several different kinds of media. Today we'll try podcast. For the shared work we do in our mini lessons this week, I thought we could listen to and watch text that connect to the issue of racism and racial inequality. Today you'll listen to a bit from the TED radio hour called The Consequences of Racism. Remember that there are two parts to this work: adapting strategies you've already used for reading nonfiction and innovating new ones that will help you with podcast. I could tell you what to do, but instead I'll have you dive in and then I'll coach. As you listen and think, are there strategies you've already learned that might apply here? Go back to the lesson platform and listen to the first 34 seconds of the podcast, The Consequences of Racism. 34 seconds isn't a lot to listen to, but I wanted you to stop and think. And did you find yourself using any of these strategies? Think for a minute as you review these. You may have thought that you know to be on the alert early to possible central themes. And the narrator here doesn't waste much time, right? That sentence that you just heard, blackness has a different set of social implications. I'm really not sure yet what he means, but it sounds important. Readers, if you were listening to this, you might also want to pause at a place like this and even rewind to make sure you heard what he said before moving on. Do you see how this is an innovation that you might have to make when listening instead of reading? Let's revise our chart to show this. After you add this to your notes, Well, keep listening to the podcast. You may be interested in that idea and listen for how it's supported, or you may find other ideas and themes. Be ready to draw on other familiar strategies and possibly some new ones as you keep listening. For example, you might listen for when the author is telling a story and when he is giving information. Go back to the lesson platform and listen to the first minute and 54 seconds. Now I want you to think and jot your thinking. How did this part add to Clint's message about what it's like to grow up Black in this country? Also, what did you notice about the structure of this part? This part might have felt very story like, so you might be thinking more about characters and themes. Or you may have been thinking that this section is already introducing possible themes, perhaps that life is unequal. And then, did you consider Clint's dad's motivations? Even though the text didn't come out and say, here's why he gave Clint that advice, we can draw on what we've learned from Hidden Figures and from life to gain an understanding. Are you seeing how the strategies you learned to help you read literary print nonfiction can actually help you understand other kinds of nonfiction texts too? So far, you've probably adapted familiar strategies. Let's see if in this next part you can invent some new ones. In a lot of the text you'll study, you'll find a new challenge. The producers bring in many voices to give more than one perspective or to give context. This makes it really interesting to listen to, but it takes some thinking to connect all the parts. This is going to happen in this next segment. You'll still hear Clint and the interviewer, plus Clint is talking about his dad, even quoting him sometimes. Then you'll also hear some clips from an earlier time period. As you listen to this next part, be ready to think about how all these voices fit together. You can go back to the lesson platform and this time listen and watch through 3 minutes and 37 seconds. Now I want you to pause and think and consider how these different parts and voices, even the background track we heard that came out of nowhere, how they fit together. You might draw on strategies you know to help you, or you might have to invent your own. Having to deal with multiple soundtracks is new work, but really, perhaps it's not that different from thinking about how parts that might seem disconnected actually are connected. You might have noticed that the sounds of the civil rights movement came on when Clint was talking about his dad, who grew up during that time. So the soundtrack, in this case recordings from that era, is there to help the listener envision that time period. It's not just filler, it serves a purpose in the podcast at that exact moment of the podcast. In the case of digital text, it seems like we could also say that there are craft moves that we could just skip over, but that actually help to support and connect the bigger ideas. You'll want to add these to your notes. And then, when you head off to private reading, think ahead to your final project. As you read, take note of any text that you find particularly fascinating or powerful. Because remember, you'll eventually select a text, digital or print, to recommend. Whatever you decide, remember to be flexible. You'll probably be able to transfer most of your literary nonfiction strategies directly, but sometimes you'll need to figure out new ways to apply them. You might even find you need to invent a new strategy to help you. Okay, readers, off you go.